Moses was born at a time of great suffering for the Israelites, who were enslaved in Egypt. Pharaoh, fearing their growing numbers, had issued a cruel decree that every Hebrew boy born would be cast into the Nile River to drown. This was meant to weaken the people of Israel, but it also became the backdrop for one of the greatest stories of faith and divine intervention. Amidst the harsh reality of this decree, a Hebrew mother named Jochebed made an impossible choice to save her son. With unwavering faith in God, she placed her newborn son in a small basket, covered it with pitch to keep it afloat, and sent it down the Nile River, entrusting him to God's care. As the basket gently drifted along the riverbank, a miracle unfolded. Pharaoh's daughter, while bathing by the river, discovered the baby. Struck by his beauty and innocence, she decided to adopt him as her own, naming him Moses, which means drawn out of the water. Little did she know, the child she rescued from the river would grow up to be the very one who would challenge Pharaoh's power and lead the Israelites to freedom. Raised in the splendor of Pharaoh's palace, Moses could have enjoyed a life of luxury. However, deep within him, the connection to his people, the Israelites, was undeniable. Despite growing up in privilege, his heart was torn between the life he knew and the suffering of his people. This seemingly small act of placing Moses in the river would set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to the liberation of an entire nation, proving that even in the darkest times, faith and divine purpose can bring about the most extraordinary transformations. Moses' early years were spent in the lavish comfort of Pharaoh's palace, where he was raised as an Egyptian prince. Despite this privileged life, Moses couldn't escape the reality of his true heritage. Though he had every advantage Egypt could offer: education, military training, and wealth, he never fully felt at peace with his position. Deep down, he was torn between the life of luxury he had grown up in and the suffering of his fellow Hebrews, the people enslaved by Pharaoh. As he got older, this internal conflict grew stronger, and Moses could no longer ignore the call of his true identity. Around the age of 40, Moses made a pivotal decision that would change the course of his life. He chose to visit the Hebrew slaves and witness their suffering firsthand. The grandeur of Pharaoh's palace could no longer shield him from the reality of his people's pain. During one of his visits, Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster mercilessly beating a Hebrew slave. In a moment of anger and rash judgment, Moses killed the Egyptian and buried his body in the sand. He believed he was acting as a deliverer for his people, but his actions were driven by personal anger, not divine guidance. The next day, when Moses tried to mediate a dispute between two Hebrews, one of them accused him of being a murderer. Realizing that his secret was out, Moses feared for his life. Pharaoh soon heard of the incident and sought to kill him, forcing Moses to flee Egypt and find refuge in the land of Midian. Moses had gone from the palace of Pharaoh to a life of exile, a fugitive without a home. But little did he know, this was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a greater purpose, as God was preparing him for the task of leading his people to freedom. At the age of 80, Moses' life took a dramatic turn when he encountered God in a burning bush on Mount Horeb. This wasn't just any ordinary bush. It burned with fire, but was not consumed, a clear sign of divine intervention. Intrigued by the sight, Moses approached the bush, only to hear the voice of God calling his name, Moses, Moses. It was then that God revealed himself to Moses, declaring, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." This was the moment when Moses was called to be the leader and deliverer of the Israelites, the very people he had once belonged to, but had been separated from for so many years. God shared his deep concern for the suffering of the Israelites, who had been enslaved in Egypt for generations, and revealed his plan to rescue them. He told Moses that he was sending him to Pharaoh to demand the release of the Israelites. Moses, overwhelmed by the weight of this calling, expressed doubt and insecurity, questioning, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He felt unworthy and uncertain of his ability to lead such a mission, but God reassured him, saying, "I will be with you." Moses, still hesitant, questioned how the Israelites would believe him, so God gave him 3 signs, turning his staff into a serpent, making his hand leprous, and turning water from the Nile into blood. These miracles were proof of God's power and presence with Moses. Even with these signs, Moses continued to express self-doubt, citing his lack of eloquence. But God promised to help him speak and provided Moses with his brother Aaron as a spokesperson. Finally, Moses accepted the call, trusting in God's assurances and preparing to confront Pharaoh. Moses' journey to confront Pharaoh was a bold and daunting step of faith. After receiving God's clear command, Moses returned to Egypt, where he would challenge the most powerful ruler of the ancient world. Armed with nothing but his staff and the authority of God, Moses and his brother Aaron stood before Pharaoh, demanding, "Let my people go, so that they may worship the Lord in the wilderness." Pharaoh, confident in his power, arrogantly dismissed their request, responding, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Pharaoh's defiance set the stage for a series of events that would demonstrate the incomparable power of the God of Israel. Pharaoh's response only hardened his heart, and instead of releasing the Israelites, he increased their suffering. He forced them to gather their own straw to make bricks while still maintaining their quota, making their labor even more unbearable. The people, who had placed their hope in Moses, began to blame him, and Moses, discouraged by the growing hostility, turned to God, questioning why he had allowed their suffering to worsen. Yet, God reassured Moses, saying, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. He will drive them out of his country because of my mighty hand." This was the beginning of the 10 plagues, each one striking at the heart of Egypt's idols and power. The plagues started with the waters of the Nile turning to blood, and followed by a series of devastating events: frogs, gnats, flies, and disease, demonstrating that the Egyptian gods were powerless. Despite this, Pharaoh's heart remained hard, and he refused to release the Israelites, unknowingly fulfilling God's plan to display his sovereignty and power over all creation. Each plague was a step closer to the ultimate liberation of God's people. After the devastating plagues that struck Egypt, Pharaoh finally relented and allowed the Israelites to leave. It seemed like the long-awaited moment of freedom had arrived, but the journey was far from over. As the Israelites marched out of Egypt, their hearts were filled with hope and anticipation. They were no longer slaves, but a free people, chosen by God to fulfill a great purpose. However, Pharaoh's pride was not easily subdued. As the Israelites continued their journey, Pharaoh's grief over losing his workforce soon turned into anger and regret. He gathered his army, the strongest military force in the world at the time, and set out to recapture the Israelites, determined to undo the release that he had reluctantly granted. The Israelites, unaware of Pharaoh's change of heart, reached the shores of the Red Sea. It was there that they found themselves trapped between the vast waters and the pursuing Egyptian army. Panic spread among the people as they realized there was no escape. In their fear, they cried out to Moses, questioning why he had brought them out of Egypt only to die in the desert. But Moses, standing firm in his faith, reassured them with words of hope. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Then, God instructed Moses to stretch out his hand over the sea. As he did, a miraculous event occurred. The waters parted, creating a dry path through the sea for the Israelites to walk. With walls of water on either side, they made their way across, stepping out in faith. When the Egyptian army attempted to follow, God commanded the waters to return, drowning Pharaoh's forces. The Israelites had been delivered, and their faith in God was forever strengthened by the miracle they had witnessed. After the dramatic crossing of the Red Sea, the Israelites began their journey through the wilderness, a place that would test their faith and dependence on God. Though they had just witnessed one of the most powerful miracles in history, the parting of the sea, their faith was fragile, and soon they faced new challenges. As they journeyed deeper into the desert, they quickly realized the harshness of their environment. The barren landscape offered no food or water, and hunger soon set in. The Israelites began to complain, remembering the meals they had back in Egypt, where they had at least sat around pots of meat and had their fill. They cried out to Moses, questioning why he had led them into the desert to starve. In response to their grumbling, God showed them his faithfulness once again. He promised to provide for them, sending bread from heaven. Each morning, a fine, flaky substance appeared on the ground, which the Israelites called manna. They were instructed to gather only what they needed for the day, reinforcing their dependence on God's provision. If they tried to gather more, it would spoil by the next morning. On the sixth day, God provided a double portion of manna so they could rest on the Sabbath, teaching them not only about physical provision, but also about the importance of rest and obedience. Yet, the Israelites' struggles didn't end there. They encountered another desperate situation: thirst. Again, they complained, and God instructed Moses to strike a rock at Horeb. Miraculously, water poured from the rock, quenching the thirst of the entire nation. This cycle of doubt and divine provision continued throughout their journey, but each time, God proved his unwavering faithfulness. Through these experiences, the Israelites learned to trust in God, recognizing that he was their ultimate provider, guiding them through the desert toward the fulfillment of his promises. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness brought them to Mount Sinai, a place of great significance. This was not just another stop on their journey, it where God had planned to formally establish his covenant with his people. After enduring years of slavery in Egypt, the Israelites had been freed, but they were still in the process of becoming the people God had called them to be. At Sinai, God had a clear purpose: to set them apart as a holy nation, a kingdom of priests who would represent his glory to the world. As they camped at the base of the mountain, Moses ascended to meet with God. There, God spoke to him, declaring his intentions for the Israelites. "If you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession." These words were a powerful reminder that the Israelites were not just freed for their own sake, they were chosen to fulfill a higher calling. The people of Israel were to be the vessel through which God's love, justice, and holiness would be made known to the rest of the world. God then instructed Moses to consecrate the people, preparing them to meet with him. The people were to wash their clothes, abstain from certain activities, and remain pure before approaching the mountain. On the third day, a display of God's majesty unfolded. The mountain was enveloped in smoke, thunder rumbled, and lightning flashed as the people trembled in awe. At this awe-inspiring moment, God delivered the 10 Commandments, setting the moral and spiritual foundation for the nation. The Israelites had seen God's mighty power, and they were given clear instructions on how to live in relationship with him and one another. This moment at Sinai marked the beginning of their identity as God's chosen people, destined to reflect his holiness to the world. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments from God, the Israelites below quickly grew impatient. They had witnessed God's power during the Exodus, seen him part the Red Sea, and had received his guidance through the wilderness. But as Moses delayed in his return, fear and doubt crept into their hearts. They were now without their leader, and they struggled to trust that God was still with them. In their frustration, they turned to Aaron, Moses' brother and second in command, and demanded that he make them gods they could see and touch, something tangible to worship. Aaron, instead of standing firm in his faith, succumbed to their pressure. He instructed the people to bring their gold jewelry, which they had taken from the Egyptians, and melted it down to form a golden calf. The people then began to worship the calf, offering sacrifices and celebrating in a drunken frenzy. This act of idolatry was a profound betrayal of the covenant they had just made with God. The very God who had freed them from slavery and had given them a set of commandments to live by was now being forsaken for a false idol. On the mountain, God told Moses what had happened and declared his anger against the people. He intended to destroy them for their disobedience and make a new nation from Moses. But Moses, demonstrating the heart of an intercessor, pleaded with God to spare the Israelites. He reminded God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and urged him to show mercy for the sake of his name. Moved by Moses' prayer, God relented from immediate destruction, but allowed consequences for the people's sin. Moses descended the mountain, saw the idolatry, and in his anger shattered the stone tablets. This act symbolized the breaking of the covenant, and was a powerful reminder of the dangers of impatience and disobedience. After the Israelites' failure to remain faithful to God with the golden calf, Moses took immediate action to restore order and deal with their sin. The consequences of their idolatry were severe, but Moses' role as a mediator between God and the people would not stop. In a moment of profound leadership, Moses went back up Mount Sinai to plead for God's mercy on behalf of the Israelites. As he climbed the mountain again, he took with him the broken tablets that symbolized the broken covenant. Moses knew that if God was to continue leading them, the people needed forgiveness and restoration. Moses' prayer was both bold and selfless. He asked God to forgive the people's sin, but if God's wrath remained, he asked that his name be blotted out of God's book. This incredible display of intercession, where Moses was willing to sacrifice his own standing for the sake of the people, showed just how deeply he cared for them. He was not only their leader, but also someone who was willing to stand in the gap for their forgiveness, even when they didn't deserve it. God responded with both justice and mercy. He told Moses that he would not destroy the people entirely, but that those who had sinned against him would be held accountable. Yet, he promised to continue leading the Israelites into the promised land. Moses, having secured this promise from God, returned to the people and took further action. He destroyed the golden calf, ground it into powder, and made the Israelites drink it as a harsh reminder of their sin. This was a painful but necessary lesson, one that emphasized the seriousness of their disobedience. Through this, Moses led the people to a place of repentance and reaffirmed the importance of their relationship with God. The construction of the tabernacle was a pivotal moment in the Israelites' journey, marking the physical and spiritual center of their worship and relationship with God. This portable sanctuary, built according to God's detailed instructions, was more than just a structure. It represented God's desire to be near his people. Every aspect of the tabernacle, from the materials used to the design, held deep spiritual significance. The Ark of the Covenant, placed in the Holy of Holies, was a symbol of God's presence and his covenant with Israel. It contained the 10 Commandments, Aaron's staff, and a jar of manna, reminders of God's law, leadership, and provision. The tabernacle was not just a place of sacrifice, but a sacred space where the people could encounter the divine. As the Israelites dedicated the tabernacle, God's glory filled the structure, confirming that he had accepted their offerings and was pleased to dwell among them. This moment underscored an essential truth. God desires to be present with his people, guiding, providing, and protecting them. The tabernacle was not just a physical place. It was a reminder that the Almighty God who led them out of Egypt and through the wilderness was actively involved in their daily lives. In our own lives, the lesson of the tabernacle remains powerful. Just as God desired to dwell among his people, he still desires to dwell in our hearts today. The tabernacle reminds us that our relationship with God requires intentionality, commitment, and obedience. Just as the Israelites were called to build and care for the tabernacle, we too are called to cultivate a space in our hearts where God can dwell, leading us through life's challenges and helping us stay connected to his purpose. Our lives can be a reflection of his presence, much like the tabernacle was for Israel, a place of worship, guidance, and transformation.